Welcome to Glass and Session. I'm your host, Val. Thank you for joining me for season 13. I'm going to start with a little story before I get into the theme of this season, which I think you're really going to dig. The first commercial wine I remember my parents knocking back and that I remember trying was some pink juice out of a half-gallon jug. The jug had a pink screw cap, and it had a cool feature that allowed you to set the jug down at a 45-degree, angle. It was classy. It was called Catawba Pink, and as a kid, I thought it was just fine. And why does it matter that this hardy, vigorously growing red Vitis labrusca grape that often finds its way into jams and jelly has just found its way into your ear holes? Because this season, my friend, I'm covering wines and spirits from a country that I have not touched on much outside of spirits like brandy and whiskey and the three-part series on booze riots, at least half of which occurred right here. Right here is this crazy country, none other than America, as in United States of America, land of the free, land of the brave, the US of A. And you know what we like us here? We like us some booze. This season, we're going to plumb the depths of the wine region's wine style, spirits, and fabulous stories as we like our drink with some tall tales, some lore, and occasional ribaldry. And as this has been the tradition on this show for most seasons, we're going to start with one of my favorite styles, sparkling wine. Sparkling wine from America? You betcha. We make some outstanding sparkling wines here in my home nation, and I cannot wait to tell you about them. But we gotta go back in time, as we do, and it all began 181 years ago on the banks of the Ohio River in 1842. I'll bet you thought the story of American sparkling wine, or freedom fizz as I'm calling it, was going to start in the wine mecca of the U.S., California, didn't you? Psych. That alone dated me, didn't it? Nay, friend, according to Christie's, it was in Ohio by one each Nicholas Longworth, a former lawyer, somewhere around Cincinnati. Oh, it gets better. He did it with Catawba grapes. See how I tied that into my story? Ta-da! Catawba! You betcha. During this pre-Civil War era, in fact, 1/3 of America's grapevines were indeed planted along the Ohio River. This was double the vineyard plantings out in Gold Country, or California. And this Longworth chap, he was, by 1860, America's biggest wine producer, boasting a cellar containing about 500,000 bottles. But alas, he died in 1865, and shortly after, so did his vines, most likely due to mildew or rot or something of that nature. 1865 became the year we turned our thirsty mouths to Joseph Masson, not the Masson you're thinking of, we'll get to him later, and then the Urbana vine growers, both in New York. First to Masson, who did have some French wine training. Know what he made? More sparkling Catawba. His brother joined the party, and after one of their sparkling wines was confused with something called, and I quote, a great champagne of the West, i.e. California, they launched the brand called Great Western Champagne Company. The wine won a gold medal in European wine tasting and was the first American sparkling wine to do so. For the next 50 years until Prohibition, it was a top brand in the U.S. where sparkling wine was concerned. Now back to Urbana, whose flagship brand was Gold Seal. They went one step further than Masson and actually hired a French dude, followed by 4 more French dudes over a 100-year period. They hailed from wineries that you've heard of, such as Moet and Chandon, Veuve Clicquot, and there was one called Marne Champagne. During the Prohibition plague, as I call it, they were able to make some sacramental wines to stay in business. Shout out to the church again. And the last French winemaker that was hired in 1967 for Gold Seal, before Gold Seal was sold to Seagram about a decade later. His name was Duveau. He had a top secret project he was working on called a Project Lafayette. This project resulted in a Napa winery opening in 1987 called Mumm. However, this was not the first California bubbly to hit the scene, as you may have deduced from the whole Champagne of the Great West comment that I made earlier. Nope. After Longworth's original Catawba Pink bubbly baby in Ohio came Benjamin Wilson's Los Angeles undertaking. Los Angeles? Yep, go west, young listener, as we park it here on the West Coast for a few decades, backing it up a little to 1855, and one each Benjamin Wilson, via the San Gabriel Winery. He was not only the first mayor of Los Angeles, but the proud producer of the first California sparkling wine from grapes grown in his own vineyard in 1855. Then Wilson's neighbor and his brother got fizz fever, opening the first ever commercial California vineyard. The neighbor, Pierre Saint-Sévin, he went off to France to study champagne production while his brother minded the farm. And when Pierre returned from France, he brought with him not only valuable training on how to make good bubbly, he did one better. He brought with him an actual winemaker, a French dude also named Pierre Deban. Pierre Deban. The Pierres built a whole new winemaking operation in San Jose, and they made 50,000 bottles of classic method bubbly, in which second fermentation, if you will, happens in the bottle in which it's sold, thus capturing that sparkle in that bottle. It cost about $1 a bottle to buy them back then. And during this time, Augustin Harasti, he's told his son Arpad, get thee to France and learn how to make champagne. Arpad did as he was told, and he studied in Épernay, and when he got back, the mission failed. And when I say the mission failed, I mean the failure of Buena Vista, the Harasti winery, because he was trying to make mission bubbly, as in sparkling wine made with the mission grape. And at least that's what was blamed for this failure. Well, Arpad was pretty much driven out of the winery, only to hire Pierre Deban, formerly Saint-Sévin's $1 a bottle sparkling California wine deal in San Jose guy. And by 1868, Buena Vista was producing 120,000 bottles a year and at a bargain low price of $1 to $1.25 a bottle. At that same time, fired son Arpad found some new friends, and he started trying to make sparkling wine with other grapes, Zinfandel, Muscat, Riesling, etc. And he created something called Eclipse in the 1870s, which was considered a successful ancestor to today's sparkling California wines. And a special note, there's a lot more to the Harasti story if you're interested, in which case you can find Brian McGinty's books on Amazon. There's one on Agoston, there's one on Arpad, and one on the Eclipse in particular. They're on Amazon. But we need to move along here because where were we? Still parked on the 19th century on the West Coast and still in the 1870s, because that's when we meet Paul Masson. Different than the East Coast Massons, mind you. You know this dude from the Orson Welles commercials in the 70s and 80s. We will sell no wine before it's time. Yep, that's the dude. Well, Masson, originally from France, paired up with another French dude, one each Charles Lafranc, who happened to have a Los Gatos, beautiful place by the way, vineyard. Lafranc sent Masson back to France to procure some kit or equipment for making champagne. Masson did as he was told, and he came back with the winemaking goodies. Then he married the boss's daughter, Louise. Sweet deal, if you ask me, because eventually Masson ended up owning the whole company when Lafranc sold his part of the wine business off. And this brings us to the 1890s. Still in the 19th century, I know, but we're going to speed up here in a minute. By 1890, San Gabriel in LA, the site of the 1855 experiment, was the largest winery in the world and was turning out 15 million gallons of vino. And sparkling wines were also being made by something called the Italian-Swiss Colony. To me, that sounds like a processed lunch meat basket, like a gift basket. But they were in Sonoma using the Muscat grape. And a not so much fun fact about this company, which was a wine company and not a lunch meat company, it was owned by Adolf Heck from Alsace. After he changed the business name to the American Wine Company, he got himself a silent venture capitalist partner in 1939, none other than Hitler's own foreign minister. Didn't see that coming, did you? This company would last another 50 years, but Heck went on to buy Korbel. We're going to get to them. Meanwhile, back east to the Midwest of St. Louis, Missouri, Cook's Imperial Champagne Cellars made their version of a sparkling wine somewhere around 1859. Did you know it went back that far? I did not. And meanwhile, back west, Masson was cranking out prize-winning sparkling wines into the next century and across the pond. His champagne, I put that word in quotes and we'll get back to that, kicked butt at the 1900 Paris Expo, and it was a much-lauded wine around the world. And don't you know that he was relishing a rock star lifestyle? He threw himself some really big bashes where people like Charlie Chaplin would actually show up, and even into Prohibition, because seriously, one could get a prescription for sparkling wine, and Masson's fizz was just the thing to cure what ailed ya. I like that. It was actually an armed robbery, reportedly, that devastated his business, took all his inventory, and pretty much forced Masson into retirement in 1936. Or at least that time, Martin Ray bought Masson's mountain winery, and while Masson's wines were still racking up awards, eventually Seagram would absorb the property, but even still today, you can visit the mountain winery, which is an awesome event venue, or you can visit the awesome website for some incredible historical photos. Not an ad, just admiring this chunk of history and that it was recorded so much in pictures. Meanwhile, the Korbel brothers, remember those guys? Formerly lumberjacks? They were making wine and brandy in Sonoma, and along came a fellow Czech winemaker to help them make sparkling wine. And to this I say back up the log truck, because why did two lumberjacks decide to make wine? This actually sounds like a joke. Why did the lumberjacks make wine? Because no one thought they would. Get it? Would. Haha. No. The lumberjacks had cut down all their trees off their land. So they stripped their land of trees, they chopped them all down, they sold the wood, and then they're looking around going, then what? And I have to wonder if it went something like this. There's Corbell Bro number 1. Bruh. Looks around at the stubbled land. Now what? Corbell Bro number 2. Let's go grapes. Corbell number 1. Sure. How much wine would a woodchuck chug if a woodchuck could make wine? Something like that. Okay, anywho, that's Corbell in a nutshell. Still around today. A fun VinePair article in the show notes is linked for your pleasure, as there was some really great pop culture trivia associated with the brand and why they too are allowed to call it California Champagne. Again, we'll get to that in the next segment. But we're going to move past Prohibition, post-World War II, because Martin Ray was still making the Paul Masson bubbly, including something called Madame Pinot. The year was 1949, and the fizz was 100% California Pinot Noir. 3 years later, his Chardonnay, which he called Chardonnay de Champagne, or Chardonnay de Champagne, exploded onto the scene. But stand by one for Schramsberg. We met them back in the Wine Cave episode, linked because it is a fun one. They were some of the first wine caves dug into the hills of Napa back in the 1870s. They are a very important part of America's sparkling wine history. Here's a little ditty about Jack and Jamie Davies, two LA kids who bought the historic Schramsberg property almost 100 years later. We're in the 1960s, where the Schramsberg sparkling was made with 3 traditional Champenoise variety: Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Pinot Blanc. Now, this is 3 of the varieties, because there were really 6, and we'll get to that in the Champagne episode I plan to do next year. But we normally just hear about Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and Chardonnay, but there are 6 authorized varieties for Champagne, just so you know. In 1972, the Schramsberg Blanc de Blanc was served at a toast-to-peace state dinner. I had no idea this would be the first American wine actually served at a White House or state event, according to the Schramsberg website, at home or overseas. And remember, our founding fathers, hundreds of years prior, they were drinking European wines, especially like Thomas Jefferson. He was into the French stuff. They were into Madeira. But this particular event in 1972 was actually in Beijing, hosted by Nixon. And oh, the irony. Imagine being the crew on that Air Force plane that had to zip out to the West Coast to California to pick up 15 cases of hooch for this event in Beijing. And around this time, in the early 70s, Moet and Chandon was building one of my favorites, Domaine Chandon in Napa. Another favorite where we literally went mudding to get to the barn to taste on a rainy January day back in 2019, Iron Horse. I still have a bottle of their 2014. I want to say it's X. I can't remember which one it is. But it would be the 1982 Blanc de Blanc that would be served in Geneva at the Reagan-Gorbachev summit meetings. If you must know, Iron Horse's website tells us it was paired with a pear sorbet La Colombe. Colombe means dove in French. For, you guessed it, another toast apiece. At this time, I'd like to toast Iron Horse with my 2014 Iron Horse. Thank you for ending the Cold War. So we're up to the 1980s now. See how we just moved ahead 100 years? That's how that happens. In the 1980s, we saw more champagne houses get in on the sunny California action. Piper Sonoma, Roederer and Mendocino, Mumm Napa, as we mentioned. Another one of my favorites, Domaine Carneros by Taittinger. They started digging the California scene as well. And listen, it wasn't just the Champenoise model, as cava producers were rolling in the 80s and 90s as well. We've got Gloria Ferrer, which is the first such model built in Carneros, Sonoma by Barcelona native Jose Ferrer and his wife Gloria. Cava is something I haven't talked about much on this episode. It's the classic method produced sparkling wine that I owe you an episode on because the grapes are really, really interesting, the original native grapes. But America's sparkling wine story, it started back east in the 1840s, and it didn't end in California where we are now. Oh, no. Because in the last decades of the 20th century, the one we just left in the dust about 2 decades ago, we had houses in the Pacific Northwest like Argyle and Oregon, in the Southwest like Classic produced excellent wines from Gruet, and back on the East Coast in the Finger Lakes, hello, Dr. Constantine Frank and Fox Run, North Fork of Long Island's Lee Brothers and Channing Daughters. And I attached an article on these. Most of these are classic method, but there are some pet nats thrown in since this is how sparkling wine really kind of started centuries ago back in France. Now, I don't have a pet nat. We're not talking about a nat, G-N-A-T. Pet nat is short for Pétillant Naturel. It's a fun type of sparkling wine that some of us still geek out over. And speaking of geeking out, if you live in the States, check out Virginia, Washington, Texas, Michigan, New Jersey, and yes, even here in Colorado. Nope, not kidding. Classic method sparklers. There are some tank, there are some carbonated, and those pet nats that I mentioned geeking out over. And speaking more of geeking out, let's talk wine law. I think I just heard some of you throw your phones. No, seriously, I talk all the time about standards of production with European wines that I fawn over. I mean, this is how we know what to expect in the bottle. It's that simple. How do we here across the pond from where sparkling wine preceded America by centuries almost? How do we define sparkling wine? I'm going to lay this out for you because we have codes of federal regulations or standards of identity, or let's start with 27 CFR 421B1, sparkling grape wine, including sparkling wine, sparkling red wine, and sparkling white wine is grape wine made effervescent with carbon dioxide, resulting solely from the fermentation of wine within a closed container, tank, or bottle. You know what it's not? It's not Frankie champagne. And by that, I mean 27 CFR 421B2, which defines champagne as a type of sparkling light wine which derives its effervescence solely from secondary fermentation of the wine within glass containers of not greater than 1 gallon capacity, and which possesses the taste, aroma, and other characteristics attributed to champagne as made in the Champagne district of France. And you know very well that we have to talk about semi-generic terms like champagne, because some people get prickly when people call just any carbonated hooch champagne. It's not. However, we have something here, like I said, called semi-generic terms thanks to a century-old legal loophole, and we are allowed to use that word even though some would prefer we did not. In other words, we can use the word champagne on our labels in the following instances. If it's a sparkling light wine having the taste, aroma, and characteristics of generally attributed to champagne, as I mentioned earlier, but not otherwise conforming to the standard for champagne, we may, in addition but not in lieu of the class designation sparkling wine, be further designating our wines as A, champagne style, in quotes, B, champagne type, in quotes, or C, American or New York's Napa Valley, etc., champagne, in quotes, along with one of the following terms: bulk process, fermented outside bottle, secondary fermentation outside the bottle, secondary fermentation before bottling, not fermented in the bottle, not bottle fermented, the term Charmat method or Charmat process, which is just tank, that may be used as additional information. Good to know, right? And if you listen closely, that was probably the sound of me throwing my phone, because I am one of those people that does not like seeing the word champagne on a bottle that is not champagne. I think it confuses wine consumers. And speaking of throwing things, I'm sure the director of the commercials for Masson California Champagne threw some things, if not some fits, while trying to get a slurring Orson Welles to nail his lines while filming the ad for this wine. It cracked me up so much that I had to leak up some of the leaked outtake videos. These were considered some of the first, I guess, viral videos, is what they were referred to. Click on Groovy History, the link in the show notes, and giggle your butt off at Orson Welles' line when he says, French. Seriously, treat yourself. It is hilarious, except for the part where it's called champagne because hashtag not champagne. Am I being petty? Sure. We all have our pet peeves, however silly, but as I get older, I try to remember and think outside my wine-addled mind thusly. I also understand that so-called normal people have better things to do than geek out on wine origin styles and details and petty labeling on a bottle. So just as a federal prosecutor would forgive me for not knowing what 18 U.S. Code 1512C2 is, or would understand why most of us aren't mildly familiar with sentencing guidelines or statutory minimums, some of us do know what that is, and some of us are concerned with those things. It doesn't matter why. I therefore cut people some slack for not giving two hoots about what the bubbly in their glass is technically called, as long as they are enjoying it. Hashtag am I right? So even if you're enjoying this little ditty, class 3 carbonated wine, which is like CO2 injection, which you've talked to, it's kind of like, think of SodaStream for your wine. It's kind of the idea. As long as you're enjoying it, that's the point. Bottom line, I love all sparkling wine, but I prefer the finer classic method in some Charmat or tank styles. I like the smaller bubbles, the delicate bubbles that tickle on the tongue. But the thing I can honestly say about America, we do it all. All the wines, all the styles, all the colors, few rules, less restrictions, freedom fizz, damn it. And that brings us to this weird little factoid that I discovered whilst poking around booze law on the TTB website. Have you ever heard of crackling wine? Me neither. Okay, so we're going to go a little bit longer because this is fun and ties in with pop culture. I cannot wait for you to pick up what I'm laying down here. Because, guys, crackling wine is a thing. Right above the carbonated grape wine in the federal regulations, we have 27 CFR 421B4 because it turns out crackling equals pétillant or frizzante. We've talked about those terms before. Just a little less pressure in the bottle as far as atmospheres and how fast that cork can come flying out of the bottle. In this case, you probably have wines you could use a screw cap for. So crackling wine is defined as a sparkling light wine, less effervescent than champagne or other similar produced wines. That's just a quick summary. Process-wise, crackling wine derives its effervescence from secondary fermentation in containers greater than 1 gallon capacity. You can call it crackling wine bulk process, and the words bulk process will appear in lettering substantially the same size as the words crackling wine. What? And another little branch in this tree that we're just going to sit under for a minute. As it turns out, the aforementioned Paul Masson, who sold no wine before its time, he produced a wine called Crackling Rose. It was a rosé sparkling wine in the late 60s or so. And from what I understand, it is a story that goes along with this wine that was the inspiration for Neil Diamond's first #1 hit, Cracklin' Rosie. According to a 2021 article by Brett Milano that I've linked up for you, Diamond heard a folktale from some locals about a place where there were more men than women. This is somewhere in Canada. I think it was a reservation or something. Essentially, these poor dudes, a lot of them couldn't get dates. There weren't enough women to go around, so they couldn't get dates for the weekend. So what they would do, they'd haul it to the local liquor store or wherever they got their wine for a bottle of Crackling Rose. The story goes that the wine becomes their woman for the weekend, and that is a quote from Milano's article. Can you still buy Crackling Rose wine? I don't think so, but can you buy wines with the word crackling on the label? Yes, you can. You can, and you should. And I probably will because it just sounds freaking fun. And I know my friends and probably yours would love for you to whip out a bottle of crackling anything on game night. Thank you very much. And then you can put on some Neil Diamond. Tell them you heard about Crackling Rosie and tell them about this silly podcast where you heard the story. Or you can play them the interview with Sir Diamond by Sandra Bernhardt, which I linked up for you because he rocks the song and the story around 50 seconds into the SoundCloud recording from SiriusXM. You can listen for yourself. I linked it up. You're welcome. Play it. Play it now. Play it now, my baby. Whew, and this brings me to the conclusion of this story, which I don't know about you, but I did not see Orson Welles, Neil Diamond, or Hitler being mentioned anywhere in our history of American sparkling wine that started in Ohio with fizzy pink Catawba. Did you? Nope. Neither did I, and this is why this is so much freaking fun. So you see, my bubble-loving friend, our sparkling wine history is winding, extremely rich in variety, influenced by visionaries from around the world who saw the potential of American sparkling wine, of our extremely diverse land, our freedom-loving spirit to create, evolve, and pursue whatever sparkly dreams. The future is limited only by our imagination and the liquor laws. And with that, I raise my glass of bubbly to that bright light of creative spirit, which brings me to the mic to share the silliness with you every couple of weeks. I raise my glass to you for allowing me a coveted space in your podcast feed and your ear holes, and to your curious spirit that made you click play in the first place. I hope you were sufficiently amused, if not informed. And between episodes, you can follow me on Twitter at WineGalaUnboxed, on Mastodon at Glass and Session, at Epicure Social. I'm Vino With Val on Insta and Pinterest, and on the Book of Face, just link to Glass and Session. Glass and Session is also on Post news at Glass and Session. Email me at val@glassandsession.com, and I'll be sure to answer you. And if you dig smartass cat content, Podcat Smokerdoodles is at Nebelung Smoke Show on Instagram, where I do check in more there than anywhere else because it's just freaking cute. There is Glass and Session and podcast swag in my TeePublic store, also linked way at the bottom of the show notes and on my website and on Smokey's Instagram. And since I don't do sponsors or ads or Patreon, it's a small way to support the Winecast and keep Smokey well stocked with treats as he sits here on my lap while I create and edit this booze entertainment for you. Glass and Session is a production and registered trademark of Vino With Val LLC. Music is Write Your Story by Joystock. Additional music this week is children's folk song A Yankee Doodle by Trig V. Larson at Nesrality from Pixabay. Website is glassandsession.com.